Who is the protagonist of The Legend of Zelda? Well, Zelda, of course. The confusion about the guy in green being not, in fact, the titular Zelda, but Link, is so old and widespread that it's reached meme status. Still, it's easy to see where the misunderstanding comes from. Why wouldn't the lead character of The Legend of Zelda be Zelda? It's not like Super Peach Brothers is a thing, or Daisy Eternal, or Samus Prime. Okay, maybe that last one's not the best example, but still, how is, say, your aunt supposed to know that The Legend of Zelda sees you follow a boy named Link who, depending on the installment, may or may not interact with Zelda the character all that much? You might indeed wonder why it's called The Legend of Zelda at all. The boring answer to that question is that, quite simply, it sounds better. However, there is a deeper layer to it. By focusing on not Link, but Zelda, and noting her evolution across different installments, we can also track how the series as a whole has grown over the years. Even though The Legend of Zelda revolutionized the gaming landscape several times by either inventing or popularizing new mechanics, when it comes to its lore, the series has always preferred evolution over revolution, often sticking to familiar and relatively simple concepts. In this sense, it acts as a true legend. The same story containing the same basic truths is retold time and again, with different variables and tone, but resulting in roughly the same outcome and message. In most retellings of this legend, it's the brave, stoic adventurer Link who goes on a quest to find Zelda, princess of the mythical kingdom of Hyrule. He then ends up having to save her from the clutches of Ganon, or whoever was ordained the embodiment of evil in that particular game. Simple though this template may sound, when you look at Zelda as a character, you realize that a silent revolution has been taking place. Where Zelda initially started out as more of an idea than a character, a mere objective for the player to pursue, Zelda has slowly been gaining a voice of her own, accruing relevance and agency across the years. To a point where, playable or not, Zelda can now be considered the main character of her own series, the true protagonist around whom everything revolves, the very soul of the games. Zelda's rise in prominence is not just noticeable in the story department. In recent years, we have seen her emerge as the lead character in a 2D-style Zelda game and a hack-and-slash spin-off. Could we soon then reach the point where Zelda will be the, or at least a playable character in a mainline 3D Zelda game as well? In this video, I'd like to take a closer look at the development of Princess Zelda over the years and what this might mean for the future of the series that bears her name. Once again, this is a rather new concept that I'm trying for a video, simply because I find the topic interesting and want to share my thoughts. If you want to help me summon the wisdom, courage and power required to satisfy the algorithm, please like the video and leave a comment with your thoughts. Oh, and fair warning, this video contains spoilers for most mainline Zelda games. The Legend of Zelda started some 4 decades ago, when the first game, aptly named The Legend of Zelda, was released in Japan in 1986, and in North America and Europe the following year. The original Legend of Zelda was a top-down action-adventure game and contained proto-elements of RPG and sandbox games. It was a success in terms of both critical reception and sales, ensuring that the game quickly turned into a series. Before the first game was even released in Europe and North America, Zelda 2 was already made available for the Japanese market, subtitled The Adventure of Link. In the following years, new installments kept coming. A Link to the Past became an iconic title on the Super Nintendo, whereas Link's Awakening was the first portable Zelda game released for the Game Boy. First and foremost, these early Zelda games laid the groundwork for the gameplay and design structure of what was rapidly growing into one of Nintendo's biggest franchises. They also showed that the developers were still in the process of setting on the series' identity. It is quite well known by now that the idea of the original game stemmed from Shigeru Miyamoto's childhood adventures in the Japanese countryside. However, it is clear that in building that first incarnation of the Kingdom of Hyrule, the series creators were heavily inspired by Western mythos. A sacred sword that can only be lifted from its stone pedestal by a chosen hero. A sleeping princess who preserves her legitimacy and power in stasis. The slaying of an evil beast whose motivations are not to be empathized with. These tropes all echo heavily throughout Indo-European myth, be it through Arthurian legend, fairy tales, or religious traditions. Early iterations of the first Legend of Zelda game had references that were even more explicit, featuring unmistakable Christian iconography. As the game grew more popular in the West, where casual nods towards Christianity could prove more controversial, these allusions in the game and some of the European localizations were phased out. Even so, the visual language of these games continued to lean towards the West. More so because, as with most newer fantasy IPs, heavy inspiration was drawn from the work of Tolkien, the land of Hyrule being home to fairies, as well as creatures strongly resembling goblins and elves. As you might imagine, within a world so influenced by Tolkien, Arthurian legend, European fairy tales and even Christianity, the role of Princess Zelda was always going to be very specific. Whether she is kidnapped or put in eternal slumber, her presence in these early games is limited, not only in terms of her screen time, but especially when it comes to the narrative weight she holds. Rather than a genuine person, she is, to varying degrees, a gameplay objective, a symbol of purity and a royal European archetype. The actor in these games is always Link. Like the knights of old, he sets out to save the princess and restore order to the kingdom, needing little more motivation than the knowledge that this is his duty, his fate. In this era, the legend is named after Zelda for the reason discussed in the intro. It sounded more aesthetic. For all intents and purposes, this was Link's story, Link's legend. In the 1993 game, Link's Awakening, Zelda herself does not even make an appearance. That game's story is actually quite interesting, because it's the first time that an installment strayed pretty far from the series' own narrative formula. But since this video concerns the character of Zelda, we'll save that for another occasion. So, while Zelda started out as little more than an appealing name attached to a story about a brave boy who defeats evil, she would soon take her first careful steps towards the center stage. With the release of Ocarina of Time in 1998, The Legend of Zelda entered the 3D era. This proved an immediate success, since Ocarina of Time became the most critically acclaimed game of all time and is still considered a landmark in video game history. With its transition into the third dimension, the game standardized ideas such as lock-on targeting, context-sensitive action buttons, and cinematic camera angles, and synthesized them into an intricate yet coherent 3D experience. These developments also demanded more from the storytelling. On the NES and Super Nintendo consoles, the hardware was so limited that telling a moving cinematic story proved rather difficult. Games still had stories, but exposition was often handled through in-game text, very limited cutscenes, or even delegated to the game manual entirely. Ocarina of Time featured actual, dedicated in-engine cutscenes with cinematic camera angles and edits. It may not look like much by modern standards, but this was little short of mind-blowing back in the day. And hell, some of those moments, like the final boss reveal, still look amazing. In summary, Ocarina of Time had a lot more room for narrative exposition, and one of the beneficiaries of that development was none other than Princess Zelda. Her role in Ocarina of Time was more significant than it had ever been, though you might not have realized this during the first playthrough. She spent most of her screen time having used magic to disguise herself as a young man named Sheik, who helps Link throughout his adventure. When you look at Zelda's part in Ocarina of Time closely, it is a natural progression of her role in previous games. She still appears as a medieval European-style princess who is in need of aid after her kingdom is engulfed by the forces of evil. She is taken away in order to preserve her life and her purity. When Sheik's identity is revealed near the end of the game, Zelda is once again kidnapped by Ganondorf and needs to be saved by Link. But rather than spending the intervening time in stasis as before, she now partakes in the story more actively, in disguise and solely as someone who aids Link in his otherwise solitary quest, but still more present than the slumbering damsel we had seen before. It's also the point where we gain some more insight into her personality, a princess who, from an early age, is concerned with the fate of her kingdom and its people, and who is able to see betrayal where her father, the King of Hyrule, does not. In retrospect, this addition of Zelda's alter ego Sheik appears to fit a pattern of the developers gradually giving Zelda a bigger role in her own series, while still being quite careful about it. Apart from a brief flashback, Zelda did not appear in Majora's Mask, the direct sequel of Ocarina of Time, but she returned in The Wind Waker in 2002, where she once again has a significant amount of screen time, and again as an alter ego. In The Wind Waker, we spend a good portion of our adventure alongside the pirate captain Tetra, who takes initiative and has an outspoken, feisty personality. Through a mid-game plot twist, it is revealed that, unbeknownst to herself, Tetra is an incarnation of Princess Zelda. And at this point in the game, the character of Tetra literally transforms into Zelda, not only in terms of appearance, but also her behavior, becoming more regal and reserved. It's actually a pretty common criticism of the Wind Waker that Tetra loses her personality the moment she transforms into Zelda, but once again, this can be interpreted as Nintendo carefully introducing a more assertive, outspoken iteration of Princess Zelda without fully committing yet. Indeed, you can see traces of Tetra in the Princess Zelda of Breath of the Wild. That last part is also true for the Zelda of the next mainline game in the series, Twilight Princess from 2006. Since Twilight Princess draws a lot of inspiration from Ocarina of Time, Zelda in this game lacks the outspokenness of her alter ego Tetra from the previous game, instead appearing as introspective and reserved. But we do see one of the earliest examples of a trait that would become staple for her character in all subsequent mainline Zelda games: sacrifice. During the midway point of the game, Zelda appears to sacrifice her own essence to save Link's companion Midna, establishing a trend where subsequent incarnations of Zelda would step forward to save their kingdom at great personal cost. While in Twilight Princess, the deuteragonist role of Midna leaves limited space for Zelda to grow as a character, this particular trait would go on to define much of her experience in future games. Looking back at these first few 3D Zelda games, we can already see the building blocks of the character that Zelda would grow into. These ideas were introduced carefully, through alter egos or by having lower stakes. Zelda did generally have much more screen time than in the 2D era of the series, but she did not yet drive the narrative. Link was very much the main actor still, banishing evil from the kingdom, with Zelda assisting him in limited capacity. But the ingredients of what was to come were already there. Zelda's transformation continued with Skyward Sword, released for the Wii in 2011. In this game, Zelda's role is reoriented in significant ways. From early on in the game, she is presented as someone who partakes in important ceremonies and rituals, acting as a sort of symbolic interpreter for the goddess Hylia. In this sense, she no longer resembles the princess archetype that had defined her early in the series, and appears to be more adjacent to a Miko, a sort of shrine maiden from the Japanese Shinto religion. This is not just an aesthetic change, however. Zelda disappears early in the story, and Link spends a good chunk of the game tracing her footsteps. This is perhaps the first time in the series that Zelda's actions drive the main events in the story. Especially early in the game, Link is portrayed as barely being able to keep up with Zelda, and is even treated as somewhat of an unwanted nuisance rather than the hero of the story. Of course, Link does emerge as a hero when Zelda is inevitably kidnapped, but in this instance, he is there to ensure the success of a plan that had already been set in motion without him. It is eventually revealed that Zelda, in this game, is the goddess Hylia reincarnated as a mortal, and sealed herself away in order to maintain the seal against evil and to ensure the success of a set plan. In one way, this stasis reflects Zelda's early days as a sleeping beauty of sorts, but crucially, this constitutes a sacred duty that Zelda herself chooses to adopt, reflecting the idea of erasing one's self in order to preserve a cosmic balance or achieve enlightenment. A concept that is more closely aligned to Eastern philosophy than the more absolutist struggle between good and evil that we see in, for example, Arthurian legend. This new role for Zelda was thoroughly fleshed out in Skyward Sword already, but the game itself was held back by, for the time, archaic storytelling. There was still no voice acting, and only basic cinematography was used to distinguish story exposition from the game proper. Perhaps that's why many fans only noticed how pivotal Zelda had become to the events of her own games in Breath of the Wild in 2017. In that game, we explore Hyrule as a sort of post-apocalyptic world, where the king of Hyrule is dead and Zelda and Link have gone missing. Playing as Link once again, we trace back the steps of both ourselves and Zelda, with most of the exposition being handled through flashback cutscenes. These cutscenes are, for the first time in the series, fully voice acted, and they also feature modern cinematography. One thing that didn't change is that Link does not speak, so in most of these cutscenes, Zelda does the talking, and merely uses Link as a sounding board to voice her thoughts, her doubts, and even her frustrations. Through these sequences, we learn that Zelda is very much on her own journey, tasked at a young age with finding the sacred power required to prevent a calamity from abandoning the kingdom. In Breath of the Wild, we get an up until then unusual insight in Zelda's inner thoughts, because she voices them to, and in a way through, Link. We get to learn about her ambitions and her setbacks. Here, Zelda becomes a fully fledged person, a person who at times struggles and even fails, as she pursues a power that is no longer inherited, but has to be earned. It's not just about screen time and exposition. Similar to her arc in Skyward Sword, Zelda drives the narrative here. Her actions save both Hyrule and even the life of Link directly. Link is still needed in order to break the deadlock and help Zelda seal away Ganon, but by now, this is very much Zelda's story. She is the guardian of Hyrule, and Zelda's fate is Hyrule's fate. Link may still be the playable character, but Zelda has in many other ways already emerged here as the main character of her own series. In the direct sequel, 2023's Tears of the Kingdom, these themes are reinforced even more explicitly. At the beginning of the game, Zelda is separated from Link and sent back in time. Through cutscenes, we bear witness to her adventures in ancient Hyrule, and learn that she sacrifices herself in order to restore the Master Sword for Link, as it is the only weapon capable of slaying Ganondorf. Again, we see an occurrence of self-erasure in order to bring balance to the universe, hinted at in Twilight Princess, established in Skyward Sword, and developed into a consistent theme through Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. In Zelda games across the decades, Link is often referred to as a chosen hero, the one who has the right and the ability to wield the Master Sword, an echo of Excalibur, and thus fully in line with Western myth. Yet from Skyward Sword onwards, we can make a stronger and stronger argument that the Chosen One is in fact Zelda, and that the player, mostly being confined to the perspective of Link, should not fool us into thinking otherwise. From Skyward Sword onwards, Zelda grew into the main character of the series, even if she wasn't the playable protagonist. A lot of the events in Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are driven by Zelda, either directly or indirectly. This begs the question, what if Zelda actually were to become a playable protagonist in a future Zelda game? After all, Zelda creator Eiji Aonuma revealed in a 2016 interview that Zelda taking the lead role was briefly considered for Breath of the Wild, but this option made it more difficult to find a place for Link in the game, and the idea didn't end up materializing. Since then, Zelda has actually appeared as a playable protagonist on multiple occasions. The first time was in Echoes of Wisdom, released in 2024. This top-down Zelda title proved an extremely clever puzzle game that also showed the potential challenges of casting Zelda in a lead role and how to overcome them. Rather than just making Zelda a stand-in for Link, giving her the same abilities as the traditional male lead, as tends to be the case when such gender swaps happen in video games, Zelda's gameplay is completely different from anything the series had offered us before. In RPG terms, she becomes a sort of summoner, using her magical powers, her wit, and creativity to overcome enemies and challenges alike, rather than brute forcing her way through hordes of enemies. Meanwhile, the recent spin-off game, Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, proves that Zelda brute forcing her way through hordes of enemies is something that can be made plausible when put in the proper context. Zelda using a sword infused with the power of light to cleave her way through the forces of evil is both extremely enjoyable and in line with what we could realistically expect of a character that has already displayed immense power throughout recent installments of the series. Zelda is far from the only playable character in Age of Imprisonment, but she can be considered its protagonist since the story is a retelling of the events of Tears of the Kingdom from her perspective. She is the clear narrative axis here, with her presence serving as the catalyst of and the driving force behind the unfolding story of a world where Link simply does not yet exist. There is a good argument to be made that the story of Age of Imprisonment is stronger than that of Tears of the Kingdom, showing that Zelda being a playable protagonist is not just feasible as a gameplay option, but can also work from a narrative point of view. Even in Echoes of Wisdom, which is a bit lighter on story and sees Zelda take Link's role of a mostly silent protagonist, Zelda is not presented as a warrior, but as a healer, a priestess, and a restorer of cosmic balance, which corresponds with the trajectory she's been on from Skyward Sword onwards. We've seen in the past that Nintendo is careful to introduce new twists to the story. In Ocarina of Time and The Wind Waker, Zelda only partially awakened from her slumber as a damsel in distress, with the more outspoken parts of her personality being sealed safely behind her respective alter egos in those games. These appearances planted the seeds of the person Zelda would eventually grow into, a healer, the custodian of Hyrule, a pivotal actor in her own story. Her new role also coincides with the Zelda series as a whole, gradually moving away from Western myth and adopting more Eastern influences, but that's a story for a different video. Zelda being the lead in 2 recent non-mainline Zelda games provides a design precedent, in terms of both gameplay and story, for Nintendo re-exploring that idea of making the princess become a playable protagonist in the next big 3D Zelda game. Since Aonuma has already indicated that he and his team were not looking to completely upend the open world design of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, introducing Zelda as a playable character, optional or not, may facilitate that creative twist on game design that Nintendo is always chasing. And who knows, what with a Zelda movie coming, giving Zelda an even stronger voice may open up cinematic and narrative possibilities that the series has not seen before. So, there you have it. Turns out your aunt was right, and it just took Nintendo a while to realize this. Zelda is, in fact, the main character of her own series. For those who truly wish to grasp the essence of The Legend of Zelda, need to understand the character it's named after. Once asleep throughout most of the game, Zelda has come to wield admirable amounts of power and relevance in the Kingdom of Hyrule, and she's become one of the deepest, most fascinating characters to fall under Nintendo's stewardship. Why is the series called The Legend of Zelda? Well, this is why. And even if Zelda remains a non-playable deuteragonist in the next mainline game, there's a good chance that her actions will define the story once more. But suppose Zelda does become playable in the next big Zelda game, what would you like to see from her, either narratively or gameplay-wise? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, and above all, thank you for watching.